He was born into nobility, yet never dreamed of power. He didn't crave fame, yet became one of Rome's most revered emperors. He ruled in the shadow of plague, rebellion, and endless war. And every night, he would write in his notebook, "Be patient, be just, be human." In this video, we tell the story of Marcus Aurelius, emperor, philosopher, soldier, and father. You will discover how an ordinary young man became heir to the throne without a drop of ambition, why he was called the philosopher in armor, how he battled insurgencies, the plague, and his own doubts, and how his words, written 2,000 years ago, still help us cope with anxiety, pain, and chaos today. This isn't just a tale about an ancient Roman ruler. It is the story of a man who showed that being strong means knowing how to remain honest. Suggest topics for new videos in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Sleep stories come out here every day. In the spring of 121 AD, in one of Rome's most influential families, a boy named Marcus Annius Catilius Severus was born. Later, history would know him as Marcus Aurelius, emperor, philosopher, and author of the Meditations, a work that became a moral compass for generations. His birth in the empire's capital promised him much, but his path to the throne wasn't written in the stars. It began with early loss, strict upbringing, and a search for meaning in the teachings of philosophers. His father, Marcus Annius Verus, came from a senatorial dynasty and held the office of praetor. He died when the boy was not even 4 years old. His widowed mother, Domitia Lucilla, belonged to a wealthy family that owned brick factories, and she dedicated herself to raising her son. However, the main influence on young Marcus came from his paternal grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus the Elder, who had been consul twice. It was he who ensured his grandson received an education worthy of a patrician and a future statesman. From his earliest years, Marcus was known for his serious and thoughtful nature. He avoided childish games, preferring reflection, reading, and solitude. According to biographers, he voluntarily gave up excessive comfort, chose simple clothing, and even slept on the floor until his family persuaded him to use at least a skin to sleep on. These traits, rare for a boy from high society, did not go unnoticed. Emperor Hadrian, a distant relative of Marcus on his mother's line, paid attention to him early on. Even in childhood, Hadrian called him Verissimus, the truest, admiring the youth's seriousness and restraint. Hadrian saw him as a possible successor. However, due to Marcus's youth and lack of a direct claim to the throne, the emperor first chose Lucius Ionius Commodus as his heir. When he died shortly after, Hadrian made a different move. He adopted the senator Antoninus Pius on the condition that he, in turn, would adopt Marcus Aurelius and the young Lucius Verus, the son of the previous heir. Thus, Marcus found himself in the direct line of succession. But this was merely a political step. His education continued. Hadrian ordered that Marcus be given the best tutors, and it was then that his deep connection with philosophy began. The first to awaken his interest in Stoicism was Diognetus, not a philosopher by trade, but a mentor who instilled in young Aurelius a love for simplicity, self-control, and inner discipline. Diognetus introduced the boy to the basics of Greek culture and forged in him a taste for reflection and a Spartan lifestyle. Then, Marcus studied under a number of outstanding rhetoricians and philosophers. Alexander of Cottium taught him logic and philosophical reasoning, forming the basis of his critical thinking. But the most significant influence came from the Stoic, Quintus Junius Rusticus. He didn't just instruct the young man in theory, he led by personal example of virtue, modesty, and strength of spirit. It was Rusticus who advised Marcus to read the works of Epictetus, which became a major milestone in his spiritual growth. Another outstanding mentor was Fronto, a master of Latin rhetoric and a staunch defender of traditional Roman values. The correspondence between him and Marcus, which has survived to this day, reveals a touching and deep bond between teacher and student. In these letters, they discuss not only style and language but also morality, politics, human weaknesses, and virtues. Interestingly, Fronto himself did not approve of his students' passion for Stoicism, considering it too harsh and detached. But Marcus had already chosen philosophy as a way of life. He began to form his personal self not through power and ambition, but through a constant dialogue with himself. Even in his youth, he started making notes that would later form the basis of his meditations. These texts were written not for readers, but for inner discipline. They were a way to stay in harmony with himself, to be honest in his actions, to control emotions, and to fight fears and temptations. Young Marcus also received a comprehensive education. He was taught jurisprudence, history, literature, as well as the laws and rituals of the Roman state. He spoke at Senate meetings, performed religious duties, and was introduced to administrative tasks early on. Despite his youth, he gave the impression of a mature and reasonable man, which was noted more than once by senators and courtiers. The childhood and youth of Marcus Aurelius passed under the sign of duality. On one hand, wealth, influence, proximity to the court; on the other, personal modesty, philosophical focus, and constant inner work. He saw luxury but did not accept it. He understood the power of authority but did not strive for it. He learned from sages, but even then, he began to seek answers himself, not in books, but in his own heart. By the time he came of age, a character had formed in him that was rare even by Stoic standards: restrained, humble, disciplined, and attentive to the suffering of others. All this would later become the foundation of his reign. A reign in which philosophy and power, for the first time in the history of Rome, merged in one person. By the early 130s AD, young Marcus Aurelius had already acquired a reputation as a gifted, sensible, and strictly raised young man. His inclination toward solitude, simplicity, and philosophical reflection amazed even those accustomed to the glitter of the Roman aristocracy. In his manner, one sensed not boyish shyness, but rather an inner composure, the result not so much of upbringing as of an innate drive for self-discipline. Emperor Hadrian, being a distant relative, watched his development closely. By 136, sensing death approaching and needing a reliable successor, Hadrian unexpectedly adopted Lucius Caionius Commodus, an adult but not particularly outstanding senator. This decision baffled many, as Commodus was distinguished neither by special virtue nor by military merit. However, Hadrian likely hoped to form a reliable line of succession to strengthen the throne. To reinforce his decision, he even granted Commodus the consular title and the name Lucius Aelius Caesar. But fate had other plans. In January 138, Lucius fell seriously ill and died. Caught in a situation where there was no time for a long search, Hadrian made a new move. He adopted Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a man honest, balanced, loyal, and devoted to tradition. This adoption came with a condition: Antoninus had to, in turn, adopt two boys, the 15-year-old Marcus and the 7-year-old Lucius Verus, the son of the deceased Commodus. So, Marcus was formally included in the line of succession. When Hadrian died in July 138, Antoninus Pius, as he came to be called, ascended the throne. And Marcus, now Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, received the title of Caesar and became the official heir. His youth was left behind, and a long period of waiting for power began. He would spend the next 23 years alongside Antoninus, observing state administration, perfecting himself as a future ruler, but without getting closer to the center of power than the emperor himself allowed. Antoninus Pius turned out to be a ruler of a rare type: peace-loving, just, law-abiding, and surprisingly patient. For more than 2 decades of his rule, the empire knew no major wars, and stability and economic prosperity allowed for an administrative system almost devoid of crises. In this calm, stable environment, Marcus had the opportunity not only to learn but to form as a person. In these years, Marcus had already begun his career in the structures of power. At 16, he received the position of quaestor, and then at 20, he became consul for the first time. Formally, these positions were part of the cursus honorum, the mandatory path of a political career in Rome. But in Marcus's case, they served not so much for advancement as for preparation. He listened to reports from the provinces, discussed affairs in the Senate, delved into legal nuances, and mastered the art of balancing laws with the needs of real people. Around this time, he married. His bride was Aeneia Galeria Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus Pius. The marriage had dynastic significance but was not devoid of personal affection. They had 13 children, but only a few survived. A tragedy that Marcus, judging by his writings, felt deeply, but with philosophical resignation. He was particularly worried about his son Commodus, who inherited his grandfather's name but, alas, not his virtues. The period of waiting for the throne lasted more than 2 decades, and during this time, Marcus did not change. He continued to keep diary entries, engage in self-analysis, read Epictetus, and reflect on the nature of duty and human weakness. His health left much to be desired. Chronic pain, chest attacks, and insomnia plagued him for many years. He did not complain but perceived pain as part of life, given to temper the spirit. Antoninus Pius, despite his advanced age, remained in power until his death in 161. He never made abrupt moves, did not artificially bring Marcus closer to the throne, and did not give him direct levers of power. And perhaps that is why Marcus was ready for rule when it finally came. Not because he craved it, but because for 20-odd years he lived in waiting, learned, formed, and sought within himself that inner clarity without which it is impossible to govern not only people, but oneself. When Emperor Antoninus passed away, the Senate unhesitatingly confirmed Marcus as emperor. But his very first decision was unexpected. He did not want to rule alone and insisted that power be shared with Lucius Verus, the very boy he had known since childhood and who was also adopted by Hadrian. This decision, a voluntary refusal of sole power, became the first step toward a reign based on moderation, cooperation, and wisdom. On the night of March 6 to 7, 161 AD, Emperor Antoninus Pius died at the Laurium Palace near Rome. The departure of this peaceful and respected ruler marked the end of an era of calm that had lasted more than 2 decades and presented Rome with the question of succession. The Senate confirmed Marcus Aurelius as emperor without hesitation, acknowledging his long years of preparation, his reputation as a just and sensible man, and his devotion to the state. But in the very first days of the new reign, Marcus took a step no one expected. He insisted that power be divided between him and Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother. It was the first time in Roman history that 2 men simultaneously and formally shared the title of Augustus, possessing equal powers. Although Marcus, as the elder and holder of the title Pontifex Maximus, retained priority in a ceremonial sense, and political documents and orders, his signature often stood after Lucius's name, a demonstrative gesture of equality and respect. The decision to co-rule was not dictated by weakness or lack of ambition. On the contrary, it reflected the essence of Marcus Aurelius's Stoic view of power as a service, not a trophy. He had known Lucius since childhood, saw his weaknesses and easygoing nature, but believed that an alliance of 2 rulers would strengthen the state, help avoid civil strife, and show the provinces that Rome remained united. Furthermore, he understood that looming external threats would require flexibility and mobility, meaning a distribution of duties. The first challenge was news from the eastern border. In the province of Armenia, a rebellion broke out, supported by the Parthian Empire. The Parthians seized the capital, Artaxata, and placed their own puppet on the throne. This meant not just a political conflict, but a direct humiliation of Rome and a violation of an old treaty. A military response was necessary. Marcus decided that Lucius Verus would lead the campaign and sent him, accompanied by experienced generals, to the east, to Syria, where the Roman legions were concentrated. Lucius did not possess strategic talents, and the actual leadership of operations was carried out by commanders Avidius Cassius and Statius Priscus. However, his personal presence maintained political balance and demonstrated that the emperors were not hiding in Rome. Meanwhile, Marcus Aurelius remained in the capital, where he focused on internal administration, judicial reform, social protection issues, and improving the lives of his subjects. One of Marcus's first steps as emperor was the expansion of the alimenta system, a state program to support poor children and orphans. He closely monitored its implementation in Italy, allocating funds from the imperial treasury and controlling the activities of curators appointed in municipalities. He also simplified procedures for freeing slaves and paid great attention to cases related to guardianship and family law. His orders on judicial reform became particularly famous. He expanded the powers of city magistrates and allowed provincial judges in some cases not to wait for approval from Rome, thereby speeding up proceedings. Marcus tried to reduce the influence of corruption, especially in the provinces, where complaints of abuse often went unheeded. His letters to procurators, partially preserved, breathed with lively participation and moral strictness. He demanded, "Serve not yourself, but the province. If you betray trust, you will lose not only my favor but respect for yourself." At this time, tension was felt in the city. The military campaign required funds, and the Senate reluctantly approved new taxes. Marcus sought to avoid violence, and even in controversial cases where punishment seemed inevitable, he chose the path of education. One famous episode occurred at a public hearing when the accused was trembling before the sentence. The emperor told him, "Fear is a bad advisor. If you are innocent, it is not needed. If guilty, it is already too late." This was not theater, but a reflection of his philosophy. Power must be firm, but not cruel. Despite the outward calm, internal tension was growing. Complaints, reports of abuses, and requests for intervention flowed from all ends of the empire. Marcus tried not to leave a single letter unanswered. He personally delved into cases, distributed lawsuits, and received ambassadors. His days began early, accompanied by secretaries, philosophers, and advisors. He did not allow himself excesses, preferring simple food and a limited circle of communication. His wife Faustina often accompanied him at public ceremonies. And although their marriage evoked contradictory assessments among contemporaries, it continued to remain outwardly strong. All these efforts took place against the backdrop of restless news from the East. Victories over the Parthians alternated with alarming reports about the spread of a disease. Troops participating in the Eastern campaign began to suffer from a mysterious ailment, a fever accompanied by a rash and exhaustion. Later, this epidemic would be called the Antonine Plague, but for now, no one realized its scale. Merchants, soldiers, and officials were already returning to Italy, carrying with them not only news but an invisible threat. But that would come later. For now, Marcus Aurelius continued to rule thoughtfully, strictly, with an inner concentration inherent more to a monk than a ruler. He did not seek popularity, did not organize triumphs, and did not surround himself with flatterers. He tried to do what he considered his duty, to maintain order, to be fair, and not to deceive himself. The beginning of his reign was a moment of rare harmony between reason and power, between philosophy and politics. He did not renounce himself by becoming emperor, and he did not shirk imperial duties by being a philosopher. He did not accept power as a personal victory. He accepted it as a heavy burden that must be carried with dignity. And although wars, rebellions, and the death of loved ones awaited him ahead, in the first years, he still believed that reason and order could keep this world from falling apart. When Lucius Verus returned to Rome in 166, he was greeted as a victor. The Parthian campaign, despite a difficult start, ended in success. Roman legions regained control of Armenia, took the Parthian capital Ctesiphon, and imposed peace on King Vologases. The Senate awarded both emperors the titles Parthicus Maximus, and the city was decorated for a solemn entry. But the triumphal processions hid the first in a series of tragedies. With the Eastern troops, a dangerous and unknown disease penetrated the empire. The first outbreaks of the strange ailment were noticed back in 165 among troops in Mesopotamia. The disease was accompanied by high fever, coughing, rash, weakness, and massive mortality. It spread rapidly along roads and camps, engulfing the provinces of Asia, Egypt, then Greece and Italy. By the next year, the disease reached Rome. Panic seized the city. Hospitals were overcrowded. Priests offered sacrifices, doctors threw up their hands, and death seemed to hover in every quarter. Contemporaries, including the physician Galen who observed the epidemic personally, recorded its symptoms and course. Today, scientists believe it could have been either smallpox or measles. The disease, later named the Antonine Plague, claimed, according to various estimates, from 5 to 10 million lives. In Rome, according to Cassius Dio, up to 2,000 people died daily. Emperor Marcus Aurelius did not leave the city. He did not retire to country villas, nor hide behind guards. On the contrary, he continued to personally govern the state, coordinated food supplies, organized aid for the poor, and allocated funds for the burial of the dead. He ordered the sale of part of the palace property, silver, luxury items, jewelry, to cover the budget deficit caused by sharply falling tax revenues. He canceled the debts of provinces weakened by the epidemic and ordered the freeing of slaves left without masters. Parallel to the disaster in the capital, pressure on the external frontiers intensified. Germanic tribes living beyond the Danube took advantage of the weakening of Roman garrisons. From the late 160s, invasions by the Marcomanni, Quadi, Sarmatians, and other tribes into Pannonia, Rhaetia, and Naricum began. Some tribes broke deep into the territory, all the way to northern Italy, threatening the very heart of the empire. This was the first time in many decades that an enemy had crossed the Alps. In 168, Marcus Aurelius, not waiting for new strikes, personally set out for the Danube. Moving with him on the campaign was Lucius Verus, as well as members of the Senate, guards, engineers, and even Empress Faustina. The emperors inspected forts, strengthened crossings, and conducted negotiations with local tribes. But at the beginning of the next year, Lucius Verus suddenly fell ill and soon died in Altinum. The cause of death was likely the same plague that continued to mow down both troops and city dwellers. The death of his co-ruler was a heavy blow for Marcus. He not only lost a political partner but took upon himself the full weight of power at a moment when three disasters were crashing down on him at once: the epidemic, barbarian invasions, and a financial crisis. Meanwhile, fighting on the Danube did not cease. Marcus reorganized the army, began recruiting, including among gladiators and slaves, promising them freedom for service. He mobilized veterans and created new legions. Military actions went hard. The enemy was numerous, knew the terrain well, and had combat experience. Marcus's troops fought under unbearable conditions, in swamps and forests, under the constant threat of disease. Nevertheless, the Romans held the border, conducted punitive raids, and concluded temporary treaties. However, just when it seemed that the northern tribes were pushed back and the military initiative was with Rome again, alarming news came from the east. In Egypt and Syria, Avidius Cassius proclaimed himself emperor. Cassius, an experienced general, hero of the Parthian War, and commander of the Eastern legions, launched a rebellion relying on rumors of Marcus Aurelius's death. It is assumed the report was false and spread accidentally. The eastern provinces, tired of instability, quickly swore allegiance to Cassius, fearing a power vacuum. Egypt, a strategically important province with its grain supplies, also recognized his authority. When the news was confirmed in Marcus's camp on the Danube, the emperor maintained his composure. He did not issue an immediate order to attack. Instead, he expressed hope that the rebellion could be suppressed without bloodshed. His words reached the provinces, and just 3 months after the start of the mutiny, Cassius was killed by his own legionaries. His head was sent to Marcus, but he refused to look at it and ordered the remains to be buried. Moreover, he pardoned all of Cassius's supporters, including his children and family. He even forbade an investigation, saying he did not want to multiply evil. Subsequently, Marcus Aurelius traveled to the east to personally restore order. He visited Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor, held numerous meetings with city councils, provincial elites, and army commanders. He did not seek revenge and did not organize show trials. His policy after the rebellion was extremely restrained. He strove to restore trust, not to suppress. Then he returned to Italy, but only for a short time. The north was still burning. The Germanic tribes were not broken, and new tribes came to replace the defeated ones. Marcus moved to the border again. It was there, in military camps along the Danube, in tents between battles, surrounded by soldiers, bodyguards, and philosophers, that he would begin to write down his thoughts, the very ones that would later become his meditations. When Marcus Aurelius found himself on the northern border of the empire again, he was already over 50. He had been through much: the death of loved ones, the plague, rebellion, the endless anxiety of a ruler torn between duty and human fatigue. His co-ruler had died. Empress Faustina passed away on the road. His own delegates had raised weapons against him, and external threats did not cease for a single year. However, he continued to serve, not because he wanted power, nor out of vanity, nor for the sake of glory, but because he perceived power as a burden that must be carried. As long as there is strength. It was then, on the border, in campaigns, in camps and garrisons, that he began to record thoughts that would later become known as to himself. A work the world would remember as the Meditations. He was not writing a philosophical treatise. It was not a work for the public. There was no address to students or followers. His texts had no general structure, chapter titles, or striving for completeness. These were short notes, internal reminders, reflections, appeals to himself, an attempt to maintain balance in conditions where it was so easy to lose it. Written in Greek, as befitted an educated man of Hellenistic Rome, they became a personal path to Stoicism, composure, and spiritual silence. Judging by everything, the largest part of these texts was written during the First and Second Marcomannic Wars. The emperor's camp was in Carnuntum, a large Roman fortress on the territory of modern Austria. Here, far from the capital, amidst snow and swamps, he led the life of a soldier. His tent stood next to the camp of the legionaries. He ate the same food as the officers, walked on foot, and in hours of rest, retired to write down his observations, doubts, and spiritual exercises in a notebook. These records became his way of remaining human. When everything around demanded harshness, he reminded himself that anger is weakness, that glory is fleeting, that death is not evil but the completion of a cycle. "Do not lose your head over those who will live 100 years from now," he wrote. "They will be just as careless as the present ones." He knew the price of reputation and was not deluded by it. He knew he would be forgotten and considered it natural. He taught himself not to rely on others, not to wait for gratitude, not to demand justice, but to be just himself. On the pages of the Meditations, there is not a single mention of his own achievements, victories, or reform efforts. He does not recall the plague, the rebellions, or even the name of his son Commodus. He consciously refuses that which might distract from the main thing, from the attempt to preserve dignity in a world full of fear, pain, and vanity. His philosophy was not speculative, but deeply practical. Stoicism, to which he gravitated since his youth, became for him not a theory, but a way of life. Every day, encountering rudeness, deceit, egoism, he convinced himself, do not expect people to be different. He wrote, "If you are outraged by evil, then you have not yet understood the nature of the world." These notes were necessary for him personally, like an anchor holding him in a storm, like a mirror in which he checked if he had changed. He was not a hermit. He ruled, commanded, made decisions, passed sentences, but even in this, he tried not to become cruel. One of his closest advisors said, he was meek not out of weakness, but out of understanding how hard it is to be human. The soldiers respected him. He did not seem alien to them, even though he was a philosopher. He sat with them by the fires, listened to complaints, settled disputes. Once, when legionaries complained about low pay, he did not punish them, but explained the state of the treasury, broke down the expenses, and then found an opportunity to review the distribution of funds. He was not feared, he was trusted. Sometimes in his notes, he addressed himself in the second person. You are not immortal. You cannot delay. If not now, then when? He did not ask fate for ease, he asked only for clarity and firmness. Do what nature requires. Love what it gives. Leave when it calls. Later, after his death, these records were collected and published. Who did this is unknown. Perhaps one of the secretaries, perhaps one of his friends. But Marcus Aurelius himself never prepared them for publication, and yet, it is this book that became his main monument. Not statues, not laws, not victories, but his words, quiet, restrained, piercingly honest. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius are not a confession and not a manifesto. They are a self-report. An emperor standing amidst the bitter cold, amidst endless disasters, wrote not about his rights, not about a divine mission, but about how to be a worthy human being, even if everything is collapsing. And maybe that is why his voice continues to sound through the centuries, through the darkness of empires, among people who are also looking for peace, justice, and meaning. When Marcus Aurelius became the sole ruler after the death of Lucius Verus, the empire was in a difficult position. Wars blazed on the borders, the epidemic had weakened the population and troops, and the financial system was under pressure due to constant spending on the army and emergency needs. However, Marcus did not retreat and did not resort to cruel measures or demonstrative luxury. His style of rule remained the same as it was during the co-rule, restrained, reasonable, aimed at long-term good. For Marcus Aurelius, philosophy was not an abstract pursuit. It became an instrument of daily choice, both in private life and in matters of state importance. He did not perceive his power as an exclusive right, but rather as a duty imposed by fate, and treated it with a seriousness born not of fear of losing it, but of the desire to use it worthily. One of the key directions of his rule was social protection. He continued and expanded the practice of alimenta, the state system of support for poor children and orphans. Under him, new funds and supervisory bodies for their distribution were established. This aid included allocating funds for food, clothing, and education, as well as creating conditions so that these children could subsequently become free citizens and serve the state. He saw in them not a burden, but the future strength of society. Marcus also consistently worked on improving the condition of slaves. Although he did not question the very existence of the institution of slavery, like most people of his time, he advocated a more humane approach. He limited the possibility of arbitrary executions of slaves by masters, toughened punishment for cruel treatment, and also simplified the procedures of manumission, freeing them. A slave released to freedom could count on the protection of the law, and not just find themselves defenseless in society. The legal system under Marcus Aurelius became more orderly and accessible. He carefully monitored the work of proconsuls and governors, regularly received reports, and reacted to abuses. He strove for judicial proceedings to serve justice, not the interests of the strong. A case is known where, having received a complaint against the governor of the province of Asia, he not only ordered an investigation but personally sent one of his legates there with the authority to remove local officials in case of violations. He perceived abuse of power not just as private negligence, but as undermining trust in the entire imperial system. In religious policy, Marcus Aurelius remained faithful to traditional Roman cults. He regularly participated in rites, supported priestly colleges, and financed the construction and restoration of temples. For him, religion was not so much a question of faith as the basis of public order and moral education. He did not come out with harsh criticism of other religions but demanded compliance with laws regarding the veneration of the emperor and participation in official ceremonies. It is with this that individual cases of persecution of Christians during his reign are connected. In particular, a large execution of Christians took place in Lugdunum, which was described in detail by early Christian sources. Although Marcus himself, apparently, did not issue decrees on widespread persecution, he did not hinder the actions of local authorities when they viewed the refusal to participate in cults as an act of civil disobedience. His position likely combined legal strictness with philosophical tolerance. He did not persecute faith as such, but could not ignore actions undermining public order as he understood it. The army occupied a special place in his policy. After heavy losses due to epidemics and Germanic wars, he reformed the composition of the legions, expanded recruitment, including from provincials, and strengthened the reward program. Veterans received land plots, and settlements were created for their families in new colonies. Thus, after victories on the Danube border, cities were founded where retired soldiers settled, maintaining a connection with the army and serving as living bridges between Rome and the conquered peoples. He strictly monitored discipline in the army, but not through fear, but through justice. It is known that during the inspection of legions, he listened to soldiers' complaints personally. One episode describes how he canceled the punishment of a centurion whom legionaries accused of injustice after a thorough investigation conducted publicly with witnesses. He was respected not only for his authority but because he shared the hardships of campaigns with the army. He did not avoid deprivation, wore a simple cloak, ate the same food, and slept in a campaign tent like an ordinary officer. In relations with the Senate, he preserved a unique style of rule. Despite the fact that imperial power had long been absolute, Marcus did not renounce the consultative role of the Senate. He regularly brought up critical issues for discussion, such as the appointment of governors, the distribution of taxes, and the approval of laws. He did not impose decisions, listened to objections, and strove for consensus. According to contemporaries, he once publicly apologized to a senator whom he had interrupted at a meeting, admitting that he had no moral right to do so, despite the title of emperor. In private life, he was strict with himself. After Faustina's death, he did not remarry and did not allow himself luxury. He continued to keep notes, reflect on virtue, the nature of power, the meaning of suffering, and the brevity of human life. His son Commodus caused him anxiety. Even in adolescence, he showed a love for games, cruelty, and demonstrative luxury. Nevertheless, Marcus did not deprive him of the right of succession, hoping that the influence of tutors and his own example would help his son mature. He was not a reformer in the usual sense. He did not change the structure of power, did not expand borders, did not start grandiose projects, but he changed the very spirit of governance, made it more moral, more human, more transparent. He ruled in the shadow of Stoic principles, not separating moral purity from state practice. He showed that philosophy and power do not have to be on opposite sides. When asked what he would leave behind, he named neither buildings, nor laws, nor victories. Everything he did was aimed not at memory, but at the fulfillment of duty. He believed that the meaning of power is not in greatness, but in service. And it was this service, quiet, consistent, and undemonstrative, that became his main legacy. When Marcus Aurelius set out for the Danube border again, he knew it might be his last war. He was already over 58. His health deteriorated every year, his former endurance was fading, but his inner resolve remained the same. He did not seek rest, did not desire privileges for himself, and despite his age, stood at the head of the army again to complete the work he considered the work of his entire life, to ensure a stable peace on the northeastern borders of the empire and put an end to the constant threat from the Germanic and Sarmatian tribes. After suppressing the rebellion of Avidius Cassius and completing the eastern expedition, the emperor focused on the fight against the Marcomanni and Quadi. He strengthened border forts, reorganized garrisons, and began a series of offensive operations during which the Romans reoccupied positions beyond the Danube. Many tribes were forced to conclude an agreement and provide hostages, and some resettled in the territory of the empire with the status of foederati, allies with limited rights but an obligation to serve in the army. During this period, Marcus hardly visited Rome. Management was conducted from camps like Carnuntum and Vindobona, from where he personally controlled the movement of legions, conducted negotiations with chieftains, and received dispatches from the capital. He wrote less in his diary but still maintained a strict schedule, participating daily in councils, studying reports, and delving into the needs of warriors. Soldiers saw in him not only a commander but a father who does not retire to his chambers and does not hide behind tribunes, but shares with them the cold, dampness, and fatigue. In 175, Faustina died, his wife and mother of his many children. Despite conflicting rumors surrounding her personal life, Marcus remained faithful to her until the end and deeply mourned her death. He deified her memory by a decision of the Senate and established a settlement in her honor in central Syria, the colony of divine Faustina. After her death, he did not enter into a new marriage, focusing entirely on governance and preparing an heir. 2 years later, he officially proclaimed Commodus Augustus, making him co-ruler. The youth turned 16, and despite his obvious lack of preparation for management, the emperor hoped that participation in military actions and proximity to real state concerns would influence his son's character. Together they went to the front, and Marcus began to gradually introduce Commodus to affairs, entrusting him with secondary decisions, observing his reactions, teaching through personal example. However, Commodus increasingly showed a penchant for theatricality, pleasures, and personal comfort. He participated in hunting, was fascinated by army spectacles, and had little interest in politics or philosophy. Marcus, despite internal doubts, did not remove him from power. He believed that love and mentorship could change the young temper, and hoped that after his death, his son would not destroy what had been created for years. In the winter, the war continued. Roman troops achieved success, but the resistance of the barbarians remained stubborn. In early March 180, while in the camp near Vindobona, Marcus Aurelius felt a sharp deterioration in his condition. He suffered from fever, exhaustion, and possibly an exacerbation of the chronic stomach disease that had tormented him since his youth. Contemporaries described his last days as calm, devoid of complaints. He continued to give instructions, receive messengers, and prepare his son for the transfer of power. He did not organize a farewell ceremony, did not convene senators, and did not write a political testament. Everything he could do, he had already done. Everything he wanted to say, he had long ago written in his meditations. He died on March 17th in the arms of his attendants far from Rome, surrounded by soldiers and secretaries, in a tent, not in a palace. His body was embalmed and sent to Rome, where it was cremated with honors, and the ashes placed in the mausoleum of Hadrian, which became the tomb of emperors. The Senate recognized him as divine and decreed to establish statues and memorials to him. The most famous of them was the bronze equestrian statue, which has survived to this day, surviving centuries, wars, and the fall of the empire. It was not melted down by barbarians, not destroyed by Christians, because for a long time they believed it depicted a saint. This mistake saved the last imperial statue of its kind. And perhaps there is something symbolic in this. With his death, an era ended that historians would later call the Golden Age of Rome, or the era of the 5 good emperors, from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius. Commodus inherited the throne, but not the character. The rule of Commodus would be the beginning of a new era of instability, violence, and decline. But that is another story. For contemporaries, the death of Marcus Aurelius was a true loss. Not only because he was a just and reasonable ruler, but because he was living proof that philosophy can live not in books, but in deeds, that power does not necessarily corrupt, that a person can remain himself even at the summit. He left quietly, as he lived, without triumphs, without sensations, without screaming, but remained in history as one of the few of whom it could be said, he was great because he did not strive to seem great. With the passing of Marcus Aurelius, not just the life of one of Rome's most outstanding rulers ended, but a whole epoch in which power could coexist with philosophy, politics with moral self-control, the burden of empire with inner honesty. He was the last of the so-called five good emperors. But the memory of him survived not only his successors but the very state he headed. His name did not disappear into the lists of rulers, it remained in the list of examples. The political legacy of Marcus Aurelius does not consist of great reforms or conquests of new territories. He did not create new institutions, did not rewrite laws, did not impose a cult of his personality. However, in conditions of a crumbling balance, constant wars, and internal tensions, he managed to maintain order, acting gently, consistently, and relying on personal authority. His style of rule became a rare example of how power can be built not on fear and coercion, but on respect, moderation, and self-discipline. He did not strive for glory, but received it. He did not impose philosophy on his subjects, but himself became the embodiment of its main principles. The way he coped with illnesses, with the death of loved ones, with rebellions, with the cruelty of the time, left a memory of a man who was able to preserve inner clarity even when the whole world was shaking under his feet. Marcus Aurelius exerted the greatest influence through his meditations, written in the last years of his life, mostly in military camps. These texts, initially not intended for publication, turned out to be universal. There are no references to political realities in them. There are almost no names, almost no mention of the author himself as a ruler. There is only a man who tries to live in accordance with reason, courage, justice, and moderation. The fate of the book is amazing. It survived, preserved by copyists, and starting from late antiquity, with each century only strengthened its significance. In the Renaissance, humanists read it. In the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers saw in Marcus the image of the ideal enlightened monarch. Thomas Jefferson kept the Meditations on his desk next to the Bible and the treatises of Locke. Kant, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche recognized his moral authority. He was not a scientist, but became a mentor, not a saint, but became a moral compass. In the 20th century, against the backdrop of global upheavals and catastrophes, the Stoicism of Marcus regained special power. He was read by soldiers in the trenches of the First World War, political prisoners in jails, philosophers in exile. His ideas formed the basis of a number of directions in modern psychology, from cognitive behavioral therapy to self-regulation practices and crisis thinking. He became a symbol of personal resilience, not aggressive, not demonstrative, but calm and clear, the kind that helps not to give up, even if everything is collapsing. Today, the Meditations continue to be reprinted and translated. They are read not for the sake of knowing history, but for the sake of inner support. They do not teach success, do not promise rewards, do not offer quick solutions. They remind us that every person, even if he is an emperor, daily faces temptations of fear, anger, resentment, laziness, vanity, and that the only way to defeat them is conscious, continuous work on oneself. The image of Marcus Aurelius is not the image of an ideal ruler, not a myth of a perfect man. It is the image of one who, having every opportunity to be cruel, weak, self-satisfied, chose the path of dignity. He did not run from power, but did not succumb to it. He did not renounce the world, but did not dissolve in it. He left descendants not marble arches and not legends of victories, but simple words written in a campaign tent. Let everything you say and do be simple, like that of one who is ready to leave life right now. In Rome, to this day, stands his bronze statue. He sits on a horse, holding out his hand without a weapon, without a crown, without triumph. He does not command, he seems to invite. To live with dignity. This is, perhaps, the most accurate metaphor of his legacy. He did not seek immortality, but remained in memory. He did not strive to teach, but became a teacher. He did not fight for eternal glory, but became an example. An example that in power itself, if it is united with reason and honor, there can still be something human.